Good afternoon, and welcome to Internet Explorer 8. You know, it may not be possible to please all the people all the time, but that's actually the challenge that we face on the IE team pretty much every day. I'm Chris Wilson. I'm the platform architect on Internet Explorer. And when I think about how we try to please everyone, the two groups that we really focus on, of course, are users and developers. Now, the big challenge is you look at this and you sort of think, you know, users and developers are really a very different set of people. They have very different needs. And when we started planning, we tried to break down what users and developers both wanted. Users, really, they're pretty simple. They want predictability. They want the web to just work. They don't want to have sites that worked yesterday stop working. They also don't want, you know, to have random sites that they go to cause malicious software to be installed on their machines or anything like that. And they also want productivity. Now, I'm sort of famous for using my mom as my example user. I actually thought about this a little harder this morning and realized that the two people that I think about when I think about productivity are my mom and my wife, because they both use the web. But they don't do it just because they like playing around with the web, right? They do it because they're trying to get something done. They're trying to do research, they're checking their stocks, they're checking their email, whatever. The third thing that users want is power, particularly today, because we're seeing a richer and richer web experience being developed and shipped on the web today. Nobody wants to feel like they're missing anything, right? Everybody wants to have the most powerful experience they can. Now, developers, on the other hand, well, actually, developers want pretty much the same thing, just in slightly different ways, right? Developers want predictability. They want the browser to just work. But their definition, of course, is if there is a specification, if there is a standard for what you're supposed to do, it should work that way, right? It should work the same way across browsers. They also expect predictability in that when we ship a new browser, we shouldn't break their site. And as this gentleman in the front row just informed me, we broke his site with our beta release. But they also need productivity. And part of productivity, of course, really is, hey, let's make sure that you can develop your sites as quickly as possible because it just works across browsers. It just works in all the scenarios you need to ship it in. But part of that, too, is around developer tools and the testing that goes behind that. And finally, of course, developers, more than anyone else, really press us for the most power they can possibly get out of the browser platform. You know, when I think about the rich web that's really taking over now, I feel like finally the Web 2.0 is really stressing the limits of what you can do with the platform that we have today. That really wasn't true 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I think the average web, most of the websites that you went to, weren't really testing those limits, and now they are. So I want to walk through each one of these areas from a user and developer standpoint and talk about how we're delivering on each one of these areas. Before I get into that, though, I do want to point out, as I think Dean said this morning, Beta 1 and this talk are really very developer focused. Right? This is very early, we're not done, but we're also talking about builders of the web and what you can do, what we're doing to support you. We're not really talking about the user experience. We will have another beta later this year. It will be a lot more focused on the user experience, but don't panic if you think we're not doing anything in user experience. That's not true. We're just not getting to it yet. We really wanted to focus on the platform and what developers needed to know about what we were doing before we ship. So with that in mind, when you think about what a predictable experience for users mean, the first thing that always comes to mind, kind of the same thing as with IE7, is security. Now, we've been really, really pleased with the payoff for the investment that we did in security in IE7. I think that's done really well. We continue to invest very heavily in security. We've really incorporated a secure mindset into everything we do around planning and building the browser. But we did have a few features that we added. The first one, pretty straightforward. The domain gets highlighted in the address bar, so you can tell what site you're on. This is one more way to help prevent phishing attacks. But we also improved the managed add-ons experience. Now, when I say this, really the big thing that we did, aside from making it a little more usable, is we pulled all of the add-ons in IE into one place. So not just ActiveX controls and toolbars and browser helper objects, but your search add-ons, your activities for that matter. Everything gets pulled into one place so you can tell what extensions you have loaded. We also did some work with ActiveX. And the focus here was really on making ActiveX more targeted, because most of the problems that we've ever had with ActiveX are around things being misused. The first thing that we did was we enabled per-user ActiveX control installs without administrative privileges. This means that if you're in a corporate network where you typically want to lock all your users down to the point where they're just a regular user, they're not an administrator, they can still install ActiveX controls if those ActiveX controls are set up to be per-user installs. Secondly, ActiveX controls, users can actually say, I only want this ActiveX control for this site, not for all sites that are allowed to script ActiveX controls, but just for this particular site, which obviously helps target where this control can be used. And finally, just sort of leveraging some of the work that's in Windows Vista. In IE7, we actually we did enable the data execution prevention and no execute bit on controls, but it wasn't on by default. Now these are on by default, which makes it really hard to execute code from a data block. So it's harder, even if you find an exploit, to actually run your own code. The next thing that we think about when we think about predictability is compatibility. And obviously, we have a little change of heart here from earlier this week. But I think that it's still critical to say users, sites, and applications must continue to work with the new browser version. Don't worry, we'll get to that later. But the browser really does need to just work. When you go to a website, you expect it to work. And I think finally is reliability. Part of reliability is really just don't crash. And obviously we've been squashing crashing bugs, and everyone, we don't want to ship any bug that crashes. But it's more than just that in IE8. And we're resilient to crashes in tabs. We can actually recover from crashes in individual tabs. And I wanted to really briefly show this. I've got a whole bunch of tabs loaded right now. And my favorite website, the Crash Me website, this has a special ActiveX control that I've obviously installed on my machine and put on only for this site. Normal users don't have this control. Don't go looking for it. And since I'm a sucker for a big red button, I'll hit the button. And obviously, this is one of the very few times I actually do want the browser to crash when I click the button. But as you expect, you get this dialog. Normally, when you click OK on this dialog, everything you had going is gone, right? Unless you remember what websites you're on, they're gone, right? Unless you remember what you're in the middle of, they're gone. But we will actually recover the tabs and reload them. And the interesting thing is, because of the way that this works, we can start doing more and more to recover more data out of these. What we've done is actually decouple the tabs from the frame, which means the frame continues to run, and it's only the tabs that will actually will need to be reloaded. Now, just for kicks, the rest of my demos, I'm going to run in this same process. I'm not going to touch anything, just to prove that this actually is pretty reliable and stable. When we think about making users more productive, a lot of that is around user experience. And again, I'm not really going to talk a whole lot about user experience. But I do want to talk about a few things. One of them is unlocking the web for accessibility reasons. One of the things that we've done in IE8 is supported the W3C's ARIA specification for HTML. So ARIA allows you to take rich internet applications, particularly targeted for kind of Web 2.0 apps, and define roles and states for all of the controls on those pages. One of the problems with Web 2.0 for accessibility reasons is you can build these really super rich controls, like tree view controls, that aren't in HTML. The problem from an accessibility perspective is it's really tough to understand what those things are. And if you use an assistive technology, like a screen reader, for example, you may have a really hard time navigating a Web 2.0 application. We don't want this to be a problem, obviously, so we've decided to support ARIA. We also improved our zoom experience, which, when we shipped IE7, we wanted to have a zoom capability. We wanted to be able to get a zoomed up view on the web, particularly because, wow, I mean, this machine that I'm running this off of has a 12-inch screen, and it's 1400 by 1050, which is really high resolution. I actually like zooming in a lot on this machine. But I wanted to just briefly show you how this works. Whoops, too far. And go to one of my favorite websites. This actually is not the one I was originally going to demo on, but so there's a lot of text in this, and if I was running on a larger screen resolution, it would be even smaller. The interesting thing about what we do with zooming in IE8 is we actually use the page layout and feed it the size of the window in scaled units. So if I zoom this up with the same UI that we had in IE7, we'll actually relay out the page with that in mind. So it reformats and still fits in the screen. You don't have to scroll all over the place. You don't have trouble like that. The great thing about this is that blog feeds are mostly textual, and they reformat really, really well. So if you zoom a blog, you actually have a much better experience than you did in IE7 when you did this, because you'd have to scroll back and forth just to get to the little control panel over here. When I think about the other things we've done to make users more productive, they're really a little more innovative. The first problem that we looked at trying to solve was the fact that everybody uses tons of web services, mapping services, blogs, web-based email, tons of other stuff. The real problem is these things are really manual today. It's a manual process to find a map address. So what we did was create this feature called activities. And activities are designed to connect users to their existing services, not inventing a new way that people have to build services, but connecting users to services that are already there from anywhere that the user goes on the web. One of the problems that I have with mapping services in particular is that unless somebody stuck a map or a link to a map on the page, it's hard to get to. And if they stuck a map on the page, they may use a crummy mapping service that I don't like, or they may have stuck it in a tiny little window that's hard to navigate around in. These are also really easy for web publishers to implement because they don't have to write any additional code to do this. They just have to write a descriptor file. So I want to run through a quick demo here for those of you who might have missed the keynote this morning, if I can find where I stuck it. So this is oops, wrong demo. Here we go. So this has been a very busy time, as I'm sure you can imagine, and I need a vacation. And anybody who knows me knows I'm a really big scuba diver. I love going diving, do it all the time, even in Puget Sound. So I want to go to Hawaii. This is a dive site, or a dive shop that I might want to go through. And they have their address down here at the bottom, but they don't have a link or anything. Right? They don't have a link to a mapping site. They don't have anything to let me know exactly where this is. So normally, with IE7 or any other browser, I'd have to select this, copy it, create a new tab, navigate to my mapping service. And then, and only then, would I actually be able to put the address in and figure out where this place was. Whoops. With IE8, though, I can select this address. I get a little contextual pop-up here. And when I pop it up, I have all of the activities that I have installed on this system right there. So I can select Map with Live Maps, and I'll even get a preview right there in the page, which hopefully will pop up. Oh, great. I can, of course, open this in a new tab just by clicking on it. Or if I wanted to have other mapping services installed, I could do that. They would still be there in the contextual menu that I got, but I would have to click out to them because we only have one per category. So I want to duck back to talk about this really briefly. The way that you define an activity is through the open service format. And the open service format is something that we're offering up to the open community through the, remind me, is this the share-alike one? Through the Creative Commons share-alike license. So anyone can take this, re-implement it. They just have to share any extensions that they make to it as well. If you're a service provider, you can offer up one of these files and actually check from your own website whether your service has been installed on the user's system. And if not, give a button so that the user can click to easily install. The next problem, the next challenge that we took on when we thought about making users more productive was that users typically monitor a lot of information on their computer. Auctions, weather, whatever, tons of information. And they're usually pulling that out of HTML pages. But this is also a manual process, right? Because these HTML pages have loads of information and you may only care about a very small portion of that page. So you frequently will navigate to a page, look for one small part of the page, over and over and over again. Now you can use feeds to fix this if you want, but a feed is really designed to be a feed of items, a list of items. And you really only want one item there, and you want that one item to be promoted as much as possible in the user experience. Also, feeds are a different format than the web page. So if the native storage format, if people are actually editing content in the web page, they may not be updated. They're not the same copy of the content. So to fix this, we built web slices. And web slices let publishers mark up sections of their web page and say, a user might want to subscribe to this. This is dynamic information that a user might want to stay updated about. So now I'll go to the demo that I was going to incorrectly before. So this is a web slice enabled copy of eBay, version of eBay. And I'm going to, since my other real passion is cameras, I keep wanting to get one of these old medium format cameras. And I usually have about half a dozen of these loaded at any given point in time because I'm watching the prices, trying to find a really cheap one. And, wow, not a whole lot. Oh, there we go. So if I hover over something that is web slice enabled, that is a web slice, I get this little subscription button that pops up. And if I click that and subscribe to it, pushed up into my user experience up here is that information. And it's being it's being automatically updated from within the HTML page, right? We get the information about how often we need to update it, and we pull it down and push it into the Windows Feeds platform and keep that information there, and we keep synchronizing it as we need to. And then, of course, you can get this little pop-out view that shows you more information about the content that's pulled straight from the page as well. And, of course, you can open it directly, go to the entire page, and that sort of thing. So the web slice format, on the other hand, is a little different because we didn't need to start from scratch with this. There already was an HATM microformat. Oops, I think this is the... Here we go. There already was an HATM microformat that did something sort of similar, but it describes a feed and items in that feed. And the problem with that is that it typically is used today to represent static content. So blog posts, for example. Blog posts are frequently marked up with HATM. We really wanted something that said, this is content that's likely to change. This is content that is intended to change. It's dynamic. It's going to change. You might want to subscribe to it. Whereas you wouldn't think of subscribing to a blog post, you would subscribe to a blog feed. So WebSlice actually reuses a lot of HATM. In fact, if you already have your content as HATMs, it's extremely easy to just say, oh yeah, and that's a WebSlice too, and get the dynamic properties of WebSlice on it. So as I mentioned before, the Windows Feed platform is actually how we're supporting both feeds and web slices. So RSS, ATOM, and web slices. Web slices are actually converted internally to an ATOM feed and sanitized, so we remove all the script and anything that might be dangerous. And then you can actually get at those web slices through the feed API, the same way that you get to RSS feeds through the feed API. And finally, as a sort of side note, the feed platform now also supports authentication, which is one of the big requests we had coming off of IE7. So now I want to switch gears after talking about the great new features we've got for integrating content or integrating services, and talk about developers. In particular, what a predictable platform for developers means to us. Because a lot of people think predictable means work is expected. Follow the standard. Of course, a lot of people also think work is expected means do what you used to do, like keep working, right? The challenge that we've had around this is we really can't tell when we go to a particular site, well, was this site just, did somebody sit there with a copy of Notepad and a copy of IE7 and create this site? Or did they create it using standards and then find out that, oh, they had to fix all these things up with IE7 in order to get it to work, and that's the content they're giving us? Or did they just write the content to standards and stop there? And if it didn't work right in the browser, whatever, you'll figure it out. So we had this idea that we were going to have to ask people to opt in to tell us specifically, hey, this is standards content. This is content that really is designed for a perfect implementation of the standards, not for an implementation that may not interpret them appropriately or may have odd ambiguities in it. But we decided that let's not do that. Let's actually make standards be that default. Let's make it so that if you take IE8 and you navigate to a page, if you have the standards doc type, if you're using standards mode rather than quirks mode, we will give you the best approximation of the standard that we can. Now, of course, authors can still, using the same HTTP header and meta tag approach, they can still tell the browser, hey, go use the IE7 behavior or the IE8 behavior when you ship the next version of the browser. That way, authors can actually choose to upgrade their content to get it to work when they're ready. They don't have to do it every time we ship a new copy of the browser. They may have better standard support, or maybe the standards changed, or ambiguities were refined. This way, it's really easy to fix a problem like the gentleman in the front row had, because all you have to do is go in, put the meta tag in the page, and we'll use the old engine. And that means it'll actually work again, instantly. Now, you still probably want to upgrade to get new standards, new features, but at least you have a quick fix to keep your content running. This gives us predictability, also known as standards, for those who want it, but it also gives predictability as compatibility for those who want that. You get to choose. So I have a feeling this demo isn't going to work because the Web Standards project was actually rather broken a few minutes ago. Let's give it a shot, though. I think the problem right now is that so many people have just downloaded the IE8 beta and are hitting the Web Standards project. Seriously, I think they've tanked the Web Standards project page. So you're going to have to imagine it was working beautifully at 9:30 this morning, and now this. Oh well. But you can all try it. You can all download the beta if you haven't already. It is actually up there, by the way, if you're having trouble getting to it. Go to the IE blog. Dean made a post after the keynote, and it's working, but one of the redirectors apparently isn't. He's got the right URL in his post, at least. Awesome. Then don't even bother. Just go to whatever URL we gave you earlier. So the next thing that we really wanted to do, and this is sort of, when I think about how the ACID-2 test fits into our picture, it's kind of a collection of somewhat arbitrary tests. It did force us to look at a few things in particular, and probably the most important place that I would point out is with HTML401. There are a few things that we just did slightly oddly, and the ACID-2 test tested those, so we fixed them. Object tag and form controls actually were the other one that we've really taken on for interoperability's purposes. We really wanted button elements to work the same way as everyone else, to remove that as a problem. But much more than HTML, we spent a tremendous amount of time working on making layout predictable. Now, I've actually been on some version of the IE layout team for a very long time by this point. I think I've been through 4 different versions of IE as part of the layout team. And when we started IE8, we have the goal of having full and complete support for CSS 2.1. This is a big goal. Like, there's a lot of stuff in there. I don't know of anyone who actually claims to do everything in CSS 2.1 completely. And we looked at it and we said, you know what? We could keep going with the engine that we have. Let's actually build a separate layout engine to do this. Let's start over, start with a great typographic base where we've got a bunch of experts in layout, and let's actually design it, what a surprise, with a copy of the spec in hand. I mean, when we started that first layout engine that's in IE7, we didn't have a copy of CSS 2.1. We barely had a copy of CSS 1.0. I think it was a draft when we started. It's time, is the short version. So the other thing, too, was we had a clear set of principles on the team around interoperability and compliance and compatibility with other browsers. We didn't just start writing, and if we hit a problem or didn't understand something, let's just go back and do what IE7 did. We actually looked at what all the browsers did and tried to resolve that in the CSS working group to make it not be ambiguous in the specification. Now, there still are some. We're still working on them. We're still resolving things. But that is our goal. Those are our principles. Now, with this clean, fresh start, and by the way, for those of you who are web developers, you probably know what I mean when I'm saying this. This is the end of has layout. We still have it in Quirks mode. But we don't have it in IE8 standards mode, right? In the default standards mode anymore. Other areas of CSS that used to be problematic, like floating in particular, it was a side effect from the layout system before. That's not there anymore either. Those are things that we can actually do really, really well. So when I look at the feature set that we have from CSS 2.1, over and above what we had in IE7, because we actually did implement quite a bit of CSS 2.1 in IE7. Some of the notable features are generated content, counters, new display table types, outlines. There are a few others that are relatively minor by comparison. We also looked ahead a little bit to CSS 3 for a couple of very targeted features. The first one of these is box sizing. Thank you. You never know where the clap points are going to be. But I kind of guessed, and the 2 guys that I thought would clap did, so I'm not too surprised. The second thing is vertical text, because we actually have always cared a lot about international layout and international typography. Vertical text is something we did before in IE, starting with IE 5 or 5. And we wanted to keep that feature, that functionality, but in an interoperable way. The next thing, as we were building this layout engine, we obviously had to test it. We had to build a lot of tests, starting with a copy of the CSS 2.1 spec in hand. With that copy of the spec, we built all these tests, and we realized the best way to get interoperability is with a comprehensive test suite, to actually have a test suite that tries to test everything. So I know, because I was a developer on the team once upon a time, there was a CSS1 test suite. Suite is probably a little bit of an overstatement. It had, I think, 1 test per section, and that test was pretty easy to pass. We actually passed the CSS1 test suite in, I think it was IE 5.5, maybe it was IE 6. But there were a bunch of things that we didn't really completely do. We just happened to pass that single test. So we built a ton of tests. And this morning, we actually contributed the first round of those tests to the W3C under an open license. It's actually not just to the W3C. It's more that we're on the CSS working group, and we're trying to help with the CSS test suite because we really do want a complete and comprehensive test suite. But we basically just publish these on MSDN with an open license, so anyone can take them and use them for nearly any purpose today. It's actually any purpose. You just can't necessarily claim that we're promoting your purpose. The big reason for doing this, other than interoperability, from our standpoint, is we need to validate our interpretation. In fact, I already saw feedback from these tests, from the publication of these tests this morning, from someone that said, oh yeah, these tests, I think you're doing the wrong thing here because of this other thing. Like there's a bug in your test case, in short, which is exactly the kind of feedback that we want. So now I want to move on to the programming model. I talked about the layout engine. I talked about a bunch of the other things we're doing around HTML. Now I want to talk about the programming model. Now, this particular slide is awfully dense. There's a bunch more details that aren't even on this slide. There are a number of things that we did. We have a lot more to do as well. Really, the goal here, because you don't need to read everything in there, the goal here is to try to be interoperable with other browsers in how they implement the details of the document object model. We try to do the same thing with attributes. We try to do the same thing with getting elements, like get element by ID doesn't pick up named elements anymore, which surprisingly is one of the big compatibility problems that we're starting to see with the new engine. Dynamic checkboxes work. All these things that really should just work now do. So the next thing that we did to enhance developer productivity, as well as trying to make the document object model predictable, was build a great dev tool, a great developer tool, and put it in the box. And by in the box, I mean all I installed on this laptop was IE8, and it has the developer tools built into it. Any machine that you walk up to with IE8 on it has a CSS, HTML, and JavaScript debugger in the system. And if you want to debug JavaScript, you click a button. You don't actually have to go figure out the magic reg key and go download some component from somewhere else in order to get it to work. You can do set breakpoints. You can inspect variables. You can evaluate expressions, all these sorts of things. You can trace styles and layout and everything else. So I want to very briefly pop through this dev tool, although I do want to say there are more sessions on all of these things. We have tomorrow morning, we have a session coming up on activities and web slices. Jane Kim's going to give that session. Tomorrow afternoon, I believe we have the layout and compatibility session with Scott Dickens. And Friday morning, we have another one on programming model and developer tools. So all of this stuff will be covered in a lot more detail then. So I'm going to very quickly just pick a random page here. And there's a tiny little icon. And we didn't want it huge because, my mom doesn't need this. I want it on her computer, but she doesn't need it. And I don't really want her calling me and asking me, what's this weird thing that I clicked on and it gives me this? And it just gives you the developer tool. Now, the developer tool obviously has all the standard stuff. You can troll through the tree and find things. You can select elements on the page. And actually, let me find something a little more interesting here. Let's find something that's clickable. You can select elements on the page. You can look at the styles on the side here. And the styles will actually tell you where they came from. You can look and see what styles you inherited from a particular element in the tree. You can look at the layout of the element, and it'll give you all of the information about what size it is, where it's positioned, that sort of thing. You can actually trace where the styles came from as well and figure out exactly why this particular element is blue or fuchsia or whatever. CSS tool basically just gives you the CSS. We're still working on the user experience for this one a little bit. But the script tool is the neatest one. So obviously we don't want to run everything in the debugger by default because it would have an effect on performance. So we do give you a one-button click to turn on debugging if it's not on already, and obviously has to refresh the page. But once you refresh the page, you can very quickly and easily just go in and, let's set a breakpoint. So I set a breakpoint on the zoom in button. So zoom out doesn't do anything. Zoom in stops me right there. I can look at the current local variables, and I should actually step a few levels in to get these things. You can add things to the watch window, get what their current variables are. You can actually edit these on the fly, and it changes things that are currently running. You can, in fact, you can look at the call stack. You can do immediate window and all the rest of these kinds of things. You can also, in the HTML and CSS display, forgot to stop debugging. In the HTML and CSS display, you can edit any attributes, any property values, anything like that as well. So you can basically modify the page until you get it to work, and then you've figured out what's wrong with it, and you can copy that back into your main page. So the point of this tool is not to be a replacement for any other tool you may use. The real point is that we think it's really important to have a good set of developer tools that are attached to the browser, right? That are part of the browser system, because then you can see what's going on in the browser while you're debugging. You're not trying to do it from a different tool that's trying to emulate what's going on in the browser. And of course, it's really important to have the tools that you need in whatever browser you're debugging on. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the work that we've done for performance. Now, this is beta 1. This isn't our ship. We're not completely done, so I don't want you to walk away with, wow, that's all they're doing for performance. We've actually come a tremendously long way with performance. But the first thing that we thought of was, a lot of performance isn't actually our code. It's not that we're sitting there spinning in a loop. It's that we're waiting for data from the network. And the big reason for that is because we were only having 2 connections at a time to a server. We've actually now increased that to 6 by default on a broadband network connection. If you're on a modem, we still stick with 2 because we don't want to swamp the modem connection. This actually has a really positive effect on perceived performance, or actually real performance over the network, because you can get speculative downloads started much earlier. And in fact, as part of that, we don't block our pre-parser on script tags anymore, which means we can start speculative downloads even earlier and get all of the data onto the user's system as quickly as possible. But the really big area that we've been taking on with performance has been around JavaScript. We have a team that works on the JScript DLL, and they've been cranking away. They have a bunch more than this even that they've been working on. But the first thing that we did was we made DOM object lookups between the Trident system and the JScript DLL much, much faster. We optimized how we actually interact with each other in order to speed the entire system up. We also garbage collect circular references now inside the JScript engine rather than waiting for the page to be broken down and throw things away. Some pages people tend to leave up for a very long time. Some frameworks that tend to stick around for a long time. That can cause serious problems over time. You can get a lot of memory leakage. And really, when I can't give the JScript team credit enough for the work that they've been doing inside the JScript engine to improve execution speed overall. There are really 3 main areas that they've just been cranking on, which are around array methods, collections, and I'm blanking on this. Array methods, collections, and the function call performance, sorry. And string methods. The string methods is one area where they've gotten tremendous improvements on some of the string methods. Some of these things they're starting to get order of magnitude improvements on, in particular narrow scenarios. Across the board, when you put it all together, that means we get significantly faster for executing JavaScript. So I want to now move on to sort of the areas where we needed to innovate. And Dean went through several of these in the keynote. But there were really 4 main challenges that we thought when we looked at how you build web applications today. We thought these are things that we really need to do something about. Web apps not being able to integrate with the navigation, the user's sense of navigation on the web. Querying for elements in pages was a challenge, because when you do this in JavaScript, it's really slow, because you have to keep asking for various methods in JavaScript. The network not always being there. Like transient network has a couple of things that it drove for us. And then cross-domain communication for mashups. Most mashups, obviously, are mashing up data from different domains. They need to be able to communicate. For the first one of these, I think we've probably all used, like my favorite example, a mapping service. And you click around and you zoom around for a while, and then you want to go back. And back doesn't take you back the last click you just were. Back takes you back to a totally different page. So we just supported, out of HTML5, the set window location hash. And IE just does the rest. This just works now. So we will fire an unhashed changed event. That means you, the implementer, can do something with that hash. And we update the address bar and the back bar navigation stack. So we will keep track of all the clicks that you're putting into the system. This also, because this is part of HTML5, of course, is starting to interoperate across browsers. The next thing we did was actually another thing that we took from a current draft standard. We implemented the CSS selector API out of the Web API working group. Another great clap point. This allows you to basically get back a collection of elements very, very quickly. In fact, we timed this, and it's roughly 50 times faster than traversing the tree by yourself in JavaScript, even in a good, well-written, tight JavaScript loop. This is a quick example that I just wrote to pull out microformats, pull out vcards, and get names and email addresses out of them. This literally took me like 5 minutes to write once I looked up what the format looked like exactly. Now, when I talk about the network being transient, there are 2 things that we really needed to do because of that. The first thing was, providing a decent local storage cache. And we've done this before, of course. Cookies were one attempt to do that, but we're extremely limited. We did a user data control quite some time ago that was a little less limited, but very, odd, let's say. Strange and difficult to use, and totally not cross-browser compatible would be another way to put it. But HTML5 actually adds currently a large number of storage interfaces, and we've implemented 2 of those, the session store and the local store. These are key value string pair caches that you can use, 10 megabytes per domain in our system, 100 megabytes total, although these numbers are, of course, somewhat arbitrary, so they may change. But this gives you not only a current session storage that you can access, but it gives you a local store that's shared between sessions and across tabs, for that matter. So you can keep state in one centralized location on the local system and have that persist. We have added already 2 extensions to that store, which I think we're contributing back to HTML5 to do for an application to see how much storage they have left on their domain, and also to clear it all at once, because currently if you want to clear the store in HTML5, you have to iterate through every item in the store and delete it, which is kind of painful. The second thing we did for network transients is something Dean did demo earlier today, which is HTML5 adds online-offline events and a state indicator. We implemented all of those, so we know when the network goes down, and we can tell your web application that. So the final challenge that I wanted to talk about, we actually, again, have a couple solutions to, but it's what I call the mashup dilemma. The dilemma here is that the most interesting web apps mash up data and components across domains, but this isn't safe. Like, without any restrictions, it's not safe to share data in this way, right? I don't want anybody mashing up anything with my Bank of America account. So today, XML HTTP request is restricted to a same origin policy. Now, there are ways around this. These are only 2 of them, and there are N at least. But if each one of them has some problem with it, right? If you inject script, well, you're putting somebody else's script in your page. That's not really safe. You can proxy it on the server side, but that has a number of problems around authentication and where it's coming from and relevance sort of thing. And it's complicated and slower, and you have to run a proxy server and all that kind of stuff. So when you roll it down to what's actually important here, really it's just cross-domain requests require mutual consent. Both sides have to say, hey, it's okay to make this connection with this other person in particular. So what we've done is implement a new object, the cross-domain request object. This really works very much like XML HTTP request, but the big difference is that when we send the request, we tell the server at the other end, this is a cross-domain request. We're trying to make a cross-domain request. And the other end, the server has to reply with an HTTP header that says, hey, it's okay to do a cross-domain request. That basically says both sides are giving mutual consent and saying it's okay to transfer this data across domain. Cross-domain requests are also always anonymous. There's no cookies, no authentication, anything like that that could be considered private data. So this is a quick code sample on how to do it. Really, the only point here is if you already know how to do XML HTTP request, most of this should look pretty natural, and it should be relatively easy to use. The only big difference, of course, is, again, the server has to respond differently. The server has to say it's OK to do this across domains. XML HTTP request, if you tried doing this across domain, of course, would simply fail. Now, the second thing is actually the flip side of this coin. It's not how to enable some cross-domain stuff that isn't there at all. It's more, some people want things to be a little bit more limited. They want to lock down the boundaries between 2 components, but they want to trade some messages back and forth. They want to be able to send messages from one side of the sandbox to the other side, and as long as they're careful about what messages they send and what messages they listen for, they can make that safe. HTML5 adds a post message on message to take care of this, to allow across document and domains you to send messages between one frame and another. We've implemented this in IE8, which basically allows you to do exactly that. You can send information back and forth, but it's safe because both sides have to participate in this. One side has to actually send the messages. They can't be pulled from that side. The other side has to be listening. So we've gone through a huge amount of things that we're doing in IE8 and have done in IE8. And there is, of course, more to come. Like I said, we're going to have another beta later this year. I want to talk about how you give us feedback on this. Now, we had a little problem in IE7 where we built a feedback system, and then we got swamped with feedback in a very short period of time. And we found that the signal-to-noise ratio of that was not quite as high as we would have liked, to put it mildly. Now, we have a lot of approaches to getting feedback. These are only some of them, but these are some of the most public-facing ones that I wanted to talk about. The first one is we have this program called the IE8 Tech Beta Program, or Technical Beta Program. These people do not get additional betas. All of our betas are public. They're going out in public. Beta 1 is public. We don't give them extra data or anything. These are just people who are actually really interested in giving us high-quality bug reports. People who actually have a proven track record of giving a high signal-to-noise ratio. They're not going to enter bugs that say, yeah, so I installed this other software and now IE doesn't work, or something like that, which is, we get a lot of those. The next thing, though, is that we really want everybody to be able to help prioritize what we do. So we're opening up public voting on those bugs. Anyone can look at the bugs. Anyone can dig through and see if their problem is a known issue. You can also vote on it and tell us, hey, this is really important to me. If, on the other hand, you don't have access, you're not in the technical beta, and if you are interested in being in the technical beta, please let me or someone else from the IE team know, because we do want more people to do that. Then you can go to the IE beta news group, post there. There are tons of people who sit there and look for bugs and want to help resolve those issues. We also have a report a web page problem tool that helps us get a hold of web pages that have problems, or webmasters for sites that have problems. And of course, as always, we have a bunch of automated customer feedback, the Watson system and that sort of thing, that tell us about crashes and hangs and that sort of stuff. So with that, I do want to say the beta is out there. As somebody said, it's actually functionally out there now. And I did check right before I started. Really what I want from all of you is please go test your content and applications. Like, we need to know, and particularly with the change in standards mode strategy that we have, we really do need people to help us both figure out what we haven't done properly in our system and get web pages that expected us to do something different fixed up, so that when we ship IE8, we will ship a great product for everyone, both web developers and users. And I did want to call out again, we have 3 more MIX sessions, one tomorrow morning at 8:30 on activities and web slices, one in the afternoon on the layout engine, and one on programming model and dev tools on Friday. Please attend. They've got a lot of great content in there. And wow, trying to get through all of this stuff in an hour was a challenge to plan and execute on. And I've been talking really fast. But finally, we do want feedback. So please hang out on the IE blog, hang out on the Developer Center, the news groups, everything. We do actually want feedback. And with that, I think we actually have a bit of time for some questions. Yeah, there's microphones on each side, by the way. So, yeah.
The question, or the problem that I had with my website had to do with the mouse over menus and the menu control. Is Microsoft going through all of Visual Studio 2008 and saying, this is going to be breaking, here's a fix such that you don't cause my website to break?
That's a great question. So let me rephrase and make sure I'm getting to the core. What you really want to know is, are we making sure that our own products expect us to do the right thing now? That is something that we are definitely working on, yes. Like I said, this is a fairly recent change, and we've been figuring out what all the ramifications of it are. Yeah?
HTML5 and CSS3 aren't done yet. How
Yep.
have you decided which bits are safe to implement and aren't going to change underneath you?
That is an excellent question that I think everyone struggles with, because you have the chicken and egg problem of you can't ship the standard until you prove it can be implemented and implemented interoperably. And you can't ship an implementation because then people start depending on it. I think the short version is we try to choose the parts that we think are relatively stable. We try not to do things that are too wild and out there. And we expect that we'll probably have to change some of them in one way or another. And also, once we do invest in an area, we really try to go invest in that part of the standard too, and try to get some agreement in the standards group around what needs to be done. And if it feels like it's really squishy and we're not agreeing on where it is yet, I think we would likely try to take some other implementation strategy. Yeah?
First, thanks. This looks really good. And second, what's the story with vector graphics, SVG, VML? Are you going to fix either of them?
Are we going to fix either of them?
Well, are you going to implement SVG, or are you going to fix VML? That's the right
question. We've looked at what to do with VML for a while. I don't know if we're actually going to get it fixed, because I'm not sure everything that fixed would mean in that context. Vector graphics is certainly an interesting space, and the challenge that we have is there are literally hundreds of web standards out there, and we need to choose which ones we can accomplish first. Like, I think the real thing that I feel really proud about the approach that we're taking is we're really trying to do a very complete and detailed job of what we do before we move on to something else. And that's one of the things that we were really focusing on with the test suite effort, was making sure that we're doing a very detailed and complete job before we move on to something else and do a partial job, because that's certainly been a problem in the past. Yeah?
What are the ramifications of the new IE8 with Windows Vista sidebar? And I walked in late, so can you have it side by side with IE7, or does it take over?
So one of the interesting things, and this actually is something that I completely forgot to show on the dev tools, is although we don't have a true side-by-side system, because we actually can't have a real complete top-to-bottom stack side-by-side, because some of the components we ship are really system components. I mean, the networking stack, for example, is a system component that's relied on by a lot of other pieces of software in Windows. So we have to install them in order to get them to work. We could do that only at the top level for effectively the layout and programming model engine. And we've basically done that with the system that we're using now with compatibility, because I can go in and say, change what mode I'm in. And I can force myself, instead of being in our default standards mode today, I can say, show me what it's going to look like in IE7. And that will switch back to IE7 standard mode. Or show me what it's going to look like in Quirks. And hopefully you don't have to do that too often. But I think, yeah, see, when I did this before, this page gets a little problematic when it goes into IE7 mode. The layout in the upper left corner kind of gets destroyed a little bit. So you would know, and the layout, for that matter, on each bar gets a little destroyed. So you would be able to go in, figure out why that is, using this system, and then fix it so that you can get it to work across both modes. So we don't really have a top-to-bottom, side-by-side stack, but you do have the ability to basically look at the layout and programming model engine side by side.
Okay, mostly it was for the sidebar, though.
So right. So the sidebar system will actually, because it's hosting our control, it will by default get the same behavior that we used to have. And although it's a new component, like we implemented a new component, that actually has been something we've done release after release ever since IE3, I think. Like anyone maybe hosting mshtml.dll, we have to work, and we have to not break that behavior. But that's exactly why we have the compatibility modes, to make sure that we don't break those things.
So all the fancy new like hover over things, we'll just, maybe you can start using those in the sidebar too?
I'm not sure yet. Actually, I don't know, because I haven't talked to the sidebar team about that particularly.
Is there still a sidebar team?
That, honestly, I know the people who are involved, and I don't know if that's what they're working on or not right now.
Okay, thanks.
I've been kind of heads down for a little while, I'm sure you can imagine.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
I was hoping you could answer a question regarding, you were talking about the typography foundation with the new layout engine. So are you actually doing ClearType, or are you using the next gen stuff from the WPF?
So it's kind of interesting because we have some shared components with the WPF team, but the implementation that we have, like we have a set of rules in the CSS 2.1 spec that we need to follow. When you look at ClearType and OpenType and TrueType, those are very far down in the system. Like that's really around basic how you draw the glyphs, in effect. And we certainly are using ClearType. We're not currently using the same type of ClearType the WPF does, the subpixel ClearType. But we are kind of, but we do have to build our own set of rules and behaviors and everything for when we, when we're trying to format and lay out lines of text, how alignment works and all that sort of thing, because CSS has a particular set of rules that they say we have to follow. So this isn't built on top of WPF or anything like that. Some of the componentry is shared, and we share a lot of the expertise across teams with WPF and even the Office teams and that sort of thing. But the code that we've written to lay content out really is ours.
Well, thank you. I also want to say, great work. Thank
Thanks.
you very much from
Thanks.
the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Next.
With the cross-domain support, how much work does a dev has to do on their server to support the new XDR?
To support XDR on the server, it's actually relatively easy. It depends what kind of server you're running. You do have to have access to the server config files, at least enough to return that. Or if you're running a server like an ASP server, you can, I had a line in my deck earlier that's the one line you add into your ASPX page, and it will actually return that in the header. Since all you're doing is adding a header, an HTTP response header, it shouldn't be that hard on any server as long as you have the ability to do that. You can't do it just in an HTML file or anything like that, but it's one step beyond that.
You can't do a meta equiv?
I don't believe you can because we don't dig into HTML specifically. The response can be anything, right? It can be any file type. And HTTP equiv kind of is intended to go the other way. It's intended to say inside an HTML file, pretend as if you had this HTTP header, and we can't do that the other way for XML or any other data type. Yeah?
Can you provide any more specifics besides later on this year for the next beta and then ultimately the release? Are we going to see it this year or next year?
Right now I think we're not really focused on when the release is as much as how far we have to go before we can release. Like, we want to make sure that when we release IE8, it's a really good release and we've done all the right things in the things that we've taken on. And that, I would not want this to get rushed out because we were trying to hit a particular date. And that's really one of the reasons why I'm personally not very comfortable giving a date. Yeah?
Just a kind of question on the ACID test. I know you kind of got ACID 2 compatibility recently. Mm-hmm. ACID 3 just came out, and I know there were some issues around that. Have you kind of factored that into plans for IE8? Are you going to get kind of ACID 3 compatibility in the next browser too?
One of the challenges that I have with the ACID test series is, two things. One of them is I'm really focused on how we make sure that we do the standards that we do well, to the point where we can actually walk away and say, okay, it should be interoperable now, and anything after that is minor bug fixing. And the ACID tests are kind of somewhat opportunistic about choosing different parts of different standards because they're combining a set of kind of compliance testing, if you will, although they clearly state they're not compliance tests, with prioritization of what standards we should focus on. Like, one of the examples is in IE8, we actually, it's actually up. Wow. Yay. Notes, actually on the Web Standards Organization site, and no, it's all in default mode, so I can say we actually passed the ACID 2 test. So to get back to ACID 3, though, there are some great tests in ACID 3. Like, a lot of those are just kind of what I was saying about the basic DOM compliance stuff. Like, I looked at this a little while ago, and our numbers had already gone up from IE7 because of a lot of the other work that we'd been doing. And when I talked about it with Ian Hickson, the kind of designer and editor of the test, he said, yeah, I don't really think you should focus on these tests. You should focus on the underlying specs and make sure that they actually get done and done well. And then they'll just work. And although that's a little optimistic, perhaps, it's still kind of the approach that we're trying to take. We're certainly looking at it because I think there's good information to be had out of it. I can't really state when we might or might not pass it, though. Yeah?
Can you comment just a little bit on what this change that you announced on Monday has meant for you both architecturally and just how that all came about?
Sure. When I think about the change that we made earlier this week, really what we were saying was we still believe compatibility is critical for us. If we ship a browser and it's not compatible, we're in big trouble. Users aren't going to like it. A lot of web developers aren't going to like it. But at the same time, we recognize that interoperability needs to be a core value for us going forward. And when we looked at all of the implications of what it meant to have IE7 standards be the default mode for the browser, even in the future when we would have different doc types, like the HTML5 doc type, it still doesn't go away quickly enough. It doesn't change the state of affairs, the current state of the web, in the way that it does if we say, hey, we should be following standards by default. And that's really why we made it, because we wanted to honor that value of interoperability. I thought it was great when Steve Ballmer and Ray Ozzie went out there and said, we actually want to be interoperable. I think it's great that they actually championed doing that change. So I thought that was great. That's really about as much as I can say. Yeah?
Speaking of changing the state of things, what's the commitment or expectation around auto update, and how long after the final release of IE8 will you commit to putting it on the auto update service? Thank you.
That's a great question, and another one that I really can't say right now. Like, right now I think we're focused on getting the highest quality we can, and since this is our first beta, we're not really ready to speculate about when or whether we would put it on auto update. Mm-hmm. Yep. I don't know. It's a short version. I don't. Like, I think it's been, the experience we've had with IE7 has been a good one. I personally hope that we can do that again, but I can't commit to it. Yeah?
Hey, Chris. First, let me say thank you very, very, very much about the default behavior thing. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
I figured you'd be a fan.
But my question is about web slices. It's clear you've been looking at microformats, the way you've kind of forked HATM for the class names for a lot of the stuff in the H slice, as you call it. While you were looking at them, has it come up, the possibility of also exposing other microformats in the same way, this kind of right-click way for, say, HCard, HCalendar?
Yes, we have discussed it, and there are a couple of things that we've run into that aren't reasons not to as much as maybe not reasons to do it, which is they're not consistent today. If you look at, like, even just as I go through the demos with activities and web slices, if it needs to be in the page to work, you get a different experience. And my mom would go to a page and it would have an event listing or it would have somebody's email address, and it wouldn't work because it wasn't marked up. And this is one of the things that I've had a lot of discussions back and forth with Contech about this, because the adoption of how prevalent they are or aren't is really important there. And I think there's a lot of interesting things being done right now on auto-detecting that could be actually really powerful. I don't think we're quite there on the client yet, though. Like, it's hard to do that really well only on the client. And of course, we can't keep sending all our data up to a service. I do think there's some opportunity there. The really exciting thing for me, though, is that with the selectors API that we have, you can actually write these pretty easily as an add-in to a page that will go and pull those things out. And I think we'll see a lot of usage that way, where it'll be another step that helps break the chicken and egg problem.
Right.
Yeah?
Is the new IE beta installable side by side with IE7 so you don't have to nuke your IE7?
The short answer is no. The longer answer, of course, is we'll do the same approach. We will have VPCs up. Anyone running a Windows system can get Virtual PC for free and get a VPC install to test. The second thing, of course, is given the viewing with different compatibility modes, you actually have the ability to test a lot of things in IE7 and IE8. And we are pretty committed to the compatibility there, so we're paying very close attention to what we do there. As I mentioned before, actually doing side-by-side with IE, we looked at very early on in the IE8 cycle what it would take to do that. And there are two problems. One of them is we can never really crack all the bonds and make it totally side-by-side. And it gets super complex for the user to choose what they want to have running to, whether they want the new stuff or the old stuff, or which is the default browser and which is the system component browser and that sort of thing. But even more so than that, the problem is we can't do it for old browsers. We can't go back to IE7 and make it side-by-side unless it's the default browser for the system forevermore. And obviously that wouldn't be a good state of affairs because we wouldn't be moving the browser forward. Yeah?
Does the compatibility mode only impact the layout, or is it JavaScript and
no,
the whole?
It affects other things other than layout. It affects the layout engine as well as object model and all that sort of thing. Okay, I think with that we got to close down. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.